I mean, there's a line in Merleau-Ponty, I think from the Nature course, that sort of sticks in my mind, where he says that philosophers should not arbitrate for science, right? So what I take him to mean by that is that it's not the task of the philosopher to sort of make decisions within the scope of scientific research about, you know, which answers are superior to which ones and where the experiment really in fact leads in a scientific debate. But a line from another part of the Nature course, you know, but the task of the philosopher is to sort of see behind the scientist's back what they can't see, right? So there's a really cooperative effort, I think, that Merleau-Ponty sees for philosophers and scientists, where I think it's important to emphasize the cooperation and not the sort of like, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong kind of approach. But the way that I think of that cooperation, like from my own perspective, is that Merleau-Ponty is constantly trying to sort of unsettle what philosophers like to try and settle. And so this kind of constant movement of unsettling what seems settled is for him the task of the philosopher. And so that's going to look very different in different debates. But one of the shapes that often takes is to constantly sort of probe at concepts and oppositions that scientists are working with, and to ask questions like whether the opposition reverses or disappears when seen from another perspective, and are these really binary in the way we take them to be binary, things like active and passive, form and content, necessary and free. So he's just kind of constantly trying to poke at what the scientists are trying to put into neat little boxes and say, you know, maybe that's a nice box, but you know, the phenomenon is overflowing it, and what are other ways we could capture it? That's the work that I see him doing, and I think that's one way to think about how philosophers and scientists can cooperate. This settle and unsettle kind of movement.
Wow, I love that. I have so much to say about that. Let's see if I could track it all. I mean, at a first pass, I think I agree. I like this settling and unsettling metaphor. I think, this goes back to Socrates, right? The gadfly kind of probing and pushing. I mean, critical theory in a way does this today. And philosophers should play that role, and phenomenologists. But I think there should also be periods of settling, like theory building in the middle. You just don't take it too seriously. Like theory building with a sense of humor, maybe, right? Or with a sense of like skepticism, like I could be wrong. So it might just be the same thing, just putting the emphases on different places. The way, I guess my answer to the question, which I believe is compatible with yours, Robin, is maybe this would be like the 1.0 simple answer to the question, is that in traditional phenomenology, going back to Husserl, to the things themselves. I think you were going to ask about this, Rahul, right? You employ reduction or bracketing or epoche, whatever you want to call it. You forget about all your preconceived notions, all the boxes we're stuck in, all the settled opinions we have, to use some of your language, Robin, and just look when I go to dinner in a restaurant, or when I get in an argument with somebody, or when I enjoy a wonderful vacation, just whatever. And when I'm on a podcast, what is it like, right? How is it really? What is this rich texture of life that is occurring? And just describe it as accurately as possible without importing a bunch of other stuff and preconceived commitments and psychological or other theories. And that's the mistake Husserl and others thought was being made, right? It was people are putting together theories based on how it ought to be rather than how it feels to be, how it is. And so, in fact, Gurvitch, who was kind of an intermediary between Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, there's an interesting story there. Part of his dissertation was saying that Gestalt psychology involves an implicit phenomenological reduction. It's saying we're not going to look at perception as just a bunch of points and assume that for each kind of sensory neuron, there's a little pointillistic dot in my experiential screen. But we're going to treat the perception as I think autochthonous is a word they used to use, as a kind of autonomous given that has its own structure, and the structure is the thing. And we could get evidence from other places, and we could build a kind of converging story, but it's kind of phenomenology first. Now, the naturalized neuro-phenomenological kind of addition to that, which does go in a way a little bit beyond Husserl and other phenomenologists, is to say, well, sometimes the empirical evidence can press on the phenomenology a little. And I kind of like these views that are kind of, again, convergent, mixed. You take it all together. Any part can kind of influence the others. And then you put together the best theory you can with all the evidence you have. But it's good to do that. It's good to sort of be, I think, to be a system builder who tries to put it all together. Going back to the very beginning, I like things in the little boxes, but then to recognize that not everybody should be doing that. There should be people poking and prodding around that, and not ever letting anything be taken too seriously, because we're fallible creatures after all, and that includes phenomenologists.
No doubt, no doubt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in Merleau-Ponty's case, it would also be just like a sort of reinterrogation of, just to think about like naturalizing phenomenology. The Merleau-Pontian move there is also to say, okay, but what is naturalizing, and what is nature, and what do you mean by that? And so it's not just sort of like poking and prodding and unsettling what happens internal to the science, but really like sort of asking us to bring into the scope of what is questionable some of the like very basic concepts, like what is empirical, and where are the limits of the empirical, and what is there an opposite to empirical, and is that opposition sustained in all contexts, and things like that.
Sorry. Of course. The other thing I'd say here is, like, in fact, a lot of scientists, they like to think that they're doing this like almost like as if they're playing this purely empirical game where there isn't any concepts involved. I think it's a flawed notion, because we all implicitly have a theory when we are theorizing. We are all within a certain Weltanschauung or certain worldview when we're doing theory. But there's something really interesting about science, and I think here's where I really think philosophy is useful. Imminent to science itself, there are all of these paradoxes and things we can't explain, and I think we saw that a lot in neuroscience, but also, of course, like in quantum mechanics, there are all these debates going on, like what's, all these contradictions, and that's where this like poking and prodding of philosophers can be super useful. Because, what I love about that is also, it's not like the scientific enterprise, something external to it comes and kind of provokes it. Within itself, something, comes up, which is like, oh, that's a surprising result. Oh, the double slit experiment, that's a bit weird. How are we going to make sense of this? So, notions like that. But also another thing is, when I spoke to someone critically, just on this note, he made a really interesting point. He was like, well, in a way, this is why society will always kind of ostracize the philosopher, because the philosopher is always going to be a bit of like the outsider, kind of like constantly saying how think about it, like in the Socratic way, think about this, reconsider this, what do you mean by that, what do you mean by this, and it can be a bit annoying, and so they can't really be put into a specific contained institution either. It has to be this place of almost the outsider within the inside, so to speak.